Good evening, and you're all very welcome. I'm Dr. Danielle Petherbridge from the UCD School of Philosophy and Director of the Centre for Ethics in Public Life. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 Frontline Defenders Annual Lecture. Together with our academic partners NUI Galway, Trinity College Dublin, Queen's University Belfast, we are very pleased to be supporting this event. Together with our other partners at UCD and Trinity College Dublin, the UCD School of Philosophy has been associated with the Frontline Defenders Annual Lectures since the inaugural event in 2013, which was given by Professor Noam Chomsky. Subsequent speakers have included Bruce Schneier, Dr. Sigrid Rausing, Professor Jan Sokol, Hua Ibrahim, and Professor Martha Nussbaum. And we hope the UCD Centre for Ethics in Public Life can help sponsor the lectures going forward into the future. The annual lectures were developed to recognise the outstanding and crucial work undertaken by frontline defenders in the protection of human rights, or more specifically to support and protect those on the front line who courageously work to defend such rights, often under incredibly difficult and dangerous conditions. We are only even more acutely aware of the vital work of frontline defenders at this historical moment with the war in Ukraine, where we are witnessing not only the violation of human rights and the military attack on civilian population by the Russian state, but also the removal of democratically elected officials and indiscriminate killing, including journalists, as well as the silencing or imprisonment of those who try to speak out or protest in Russia. This, of course, is occurring while other human rights violations continue to take place around the world. Now, more than ever, we need the work of frontline defenders and other human rights organisations. I wish to thank the Frontline Defenders team for their work and for the organisation of this event, especially Laura O'Leary, and also Fiona Lavin of the UCD Centre for Ethics in Public Life, and Professor Maria Bargramian for helping to organise this event, as well as the team here at the Museum of Literature Ireland. I would now like to hand over to Andrew Anderson to introduce and to chair this annual lecture. Andrew Anderson is the Executive Director of Frontline Defenders, who will now introduce our special guest for this evening's lecture.
Thank you, Danielle. Let me join in the thanks to the Museum of Literature for hosting us, and to our partners at UCD, TCD, Queen's and NUI Galway for the hosting of the lecture here this afternoon, but also the couple of lectures we'll have in Belfast and Galway as part of this tour. We're also live streaming this evening, or this afternoon, so be aware that you are being recorded. We will have it's available live, but it will also be available on the Frontline Defenders YouTube channel next week, if you're interested to go back and see if you can understand it better the second time, which I might have to do. It's our great pleasure to introduce here Anat Bilecki, Albert Schweitzer Professor of Philosophy at Quinnipiac University, was that close? And Professor of Philosophy retired at Tel Aviv University. She's been a visiting scholar at Cambridge, Harvard, Boston, MIT, Bergen, Princeton, and the National Humanities Center in North Carolina. She writes on Wittgenstein, Hobbes, analytic philosophy, political thought, digital culture, and human rights. And in 2019, she published a very well-received book titled Philosophy of Human Rights, A Systematic Introduction, which examines some of the challenging issues that we face around women's rights, minority rights, disability rights, the context of global poverty and how that impacts on the realization of human rights, humanitarian intervention. So we look forward to a lecture which draws together some of those philosophical themes which are challenges, but particularly as an organisation which is set up to work for the protection of human rights defenders. We're also pleased to welcome Anat as someone who's been active in a very practical way in working for human rights in Israel and Palestine. She was the chair of the board of B'Tselem, one of the leading human rights organizations in Israel from 2001 to 2006, and has been active in a number of different human rights organizations there. And we were discussing before we came here, I was in Israel in 2018, Israel and Palestine in 2018, meeting with human rights defenders, many of whom were facing extremely difficult context in which to continue their work for human rights. And of course, whenever you go to that part of the world and are meeting with Palestinian defenders, you understand the very difficult challenges that they face and the struggle to continue to be able to work peacefully for human rights in that context. But it was very marked at that time also to see the pressure that Israeli human rights organizations were under, and B'Tselem in particular had been under a lot of attack and pressure at that time. So it's a real privilege and a pleasure to welcome Anat as somebody who combines that academic rigor and interesting philosophical approach to human rights and discussing some of the tough human rights issues that we work with, as well as that practical experience of worked with a human rights organization or with human rights organizations in a very difficult context. So I'm really looking forward, as I'm sure all you are, to this lecture. So let me welcome Anat, and we'll have an opportunity at the end to have some questions and answers, and look forward to that discussion as well. Thank you. Anat.
I don't need my picture up there all the time, right? Thank you, Danielle, and thanks, Andrew. There's always personal thanks and contextualization of every talk. And for many months, I said, how am I going to talk about anything without mentioning the pandemic? Then this month, how am I going to talk about human rights without mentioning the Ukraine? So I'm not going to mention anything. I'm just going to say that I am, I think, independently biased, coming from Israel, Palestine, from philosophy, from a human rights organization, and I'll talk about that a lot in a moment, a human rights organization which is problematic for certain people. What I'll try to do in this presentation is straddle the different biases that I carry. I did say once upon a time that philosophy is my profession, politics is my life. I think it still is that way. No matter how much philosophy I try to do and how clean, whatever that means, I want to keep the philosophy, politics always has to come in. And I say that with great joy, actually, not with any complaint. So, this is called Politicizing Human Rights in Palestine, Israel. All sorts of little notes I want to make, like every time you see in the news, it'll say Israel-Palestine. And I always wonder about that. Why is it Israel-Palestine? Why is it not Palestine-Israel? That's my leaning towards philosophy of language. But think of that. You never see Palestine-Israel. You always see Israel-Palestine. But what could I possibly mean by saying politicizing human rights? I'm not asking what do I mean by saying politics, but what do I mean by politicizing human rights? And there is the very banal now, everything is political. Definitely those of us who have been in any type of feminist movement have learned that from the day we were born, that everything is political. Well, that's not what I'm saying when I say politicizing human rights. At the other extreme, there's a different, very superficial, I think, idea of politics as being political partisanship. And that sees the political always as being a matter of political allegiance to an ideology, to a party, to a group, to a state. Well, I'm not saying that either. So there's not the superficial, I am for X, but neither is there the very deep, but not to our point here, everything is political. So between the deep that we share, I think, many of us, and the superficial, automatically political, I try to walk a middle ground that recognizes political issues for what they are, political, but sees human rights as, yes, political, both theoretically and practically. And I dare say commendably so. I think human rights should be political. I think they even are political, but I'm not sure that everybody agrees about that. Here's another little linguistic thing. I just said human rights are. I sometimes say, many of us sometimes say human rights is with a capital H and a capital R. So there's that community or that idea or that whole area called human rights in the singular, and there are human rights, not to mention communities, people, and again, ideas. So what human rights am I talking about exactly? Well, the first question that usually comes up is how can human rights not be political? And this is what I get from people outside the human rights community. It's clear to the ordinary speaker that, of course, human rights are political. They're part of our political life, and strange as it may seem, may be foreign to many, the mantra in most of the human rights community is human rights are not political. And that's what I want to figure out now. And when I say most of the human rights community, obviously it's the people I've met or the things that I've read. There might be people here working in human rights who think human rights are political. But what we hear in many, many contexts is human rights are not political. Why? Where could that idea come from, that human rights are not political? Well, the first idea that comes up, of course, is the idea of universalism, and that word, that idea, that concept, universalism, was posited, of course, so strongly, I don't think flippantly, by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Our Bible, so to speak, our sacred text, started only in 1948, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights coming out of the UN, and that word universal, that you couldn't have that document without the universal. That universalism was presupposed and actually led to interesting philosophical discussions and debates, such as, for instance, what are the common roots for everyone of human rights? Can we say something universal about human nature? Do we all share something that is there at the basis of human rights? Even then, in 1948, there were some people saying, oh, no, 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 cultures are relative. Most famous is a statement or a tiny little article put out by the American Anthropological Association that said, no such thing as universalism. And they were shouted down at that point. That's really in now, and we'll get to that in a minute. Okay. Secondly, beyond that theoretical idea of universalism, there is the practical question. Why should we or shouldn't we, as human rightists, be universal? And if you look at the history, and usually the history gives pride of place to the Red Cross as the first human rights organization, well, the point was you mustn't be political so as not to be perceived as taking sides. And it got very, very down to earth. You couldn't go into POW camps if you were thought to be on a certain side. And the Red Cross wanted to go into camps of all sorts in order to do their work. So it seemed that there was something very practical about claiming universalism and not being political. When you look at organizations today, I find it fascinating to see which of them insist on the universalism and which of them are saying, oh yes, I'm on this side or that side. When you look at the organizations and see what they say about themselves, and we'll be looking at several organizations today, you see them trying to be apolitical, especially what I am calling local organizations. So let's say there are local organizations in Israel, in Palestine, in France, in Italy, in Ireland, of course. And then there are international organizations. Amnesty comes to mind first, Oxfam, Human Rights Watch, etc. What are they saying? Well, I think the local organizations are the ones caught in a bind. They don't know if they should be political or not. So, and I'm not trying to trash any organization, they pretend to be apolitical. In the organizations that I've worked with or for forever, the point was never to sign a petition. Petitions come out of political people, political groups. You don't sign a petition unless the petition is only about human rights and only signed by human rights organizations. What is going on here? Are they putting on a show? Well, I think some do own up to being political. Others insist on apolitical universalism, usually legalism, and I think they are tied up in knots. Are they cynical? Perhaps. Definitely the ones who are working on the ground and seeing who's going to fund them, who's going to put them in jail, who's going to come with any sort of complaint to what they're doing. It is always a good bet to stay universal. And again, universal meaning neutral, impartial, not political. The methodology is usually turning to international law. No one can blame, and we'll see in a minute how we can, but the feeling was for many years, no one can blame international law for being biased, being on anyone's side. So that was where most organizations went, I would say, in the 80s or 90s. I looked to Andrew to correct me on some of these because he's had a different experience with different organizations. But there were years when all we did in human rights was write reports that have to do with international law. That was clean, that was universal. Nobody could be accused of being on a side. Okay, well, here's the rub. And this will be the end of my philosophizing, and I will finally get to the ground. The assumed universalism underlying international law has been, in the past few decades, under intense criticism. On the very theoretical level, we have critique really thrown up against the basics of the liberalism that undergirded the equality and liberty at the basis of human rights. Whether one becomes a relativist, so some people go relativism, and return back to the American Anthropological Association, saying that we must recognize different cultures, different places, different sets of values, different ways of living. And in that sense, you desert the rationalistic basis of liberalism. You desert it in other ways as well by going with a philosopher called Richard Rorty, who says, stop analyzing things logically. Start feeling, start moving towards emotions. That's what you should do when you do human rights. So this is a deep critique of universalism within liberalism in the philosophical discussion. It is philosophical, even though they all pretend to be human rightists. There is a more grounded anti-universalism, which I personally love, done by legal scholars. The two names that I always bring up are Balakrishnan Rajagopal, who wrote a book called International Law from Below in 2003, and very famously Mikhail Matua, Savages, Victims, and Saviors, The Metaphor of Human Rights. And both of them are legal scholars showing us how international law is Western through and through. The point here is almost paradoxical. You tried to lean on international law to become universalist. Well, we'll show you that international law itself is not at all universalist. And then the question is, what is to be done in that area? Well, Balakrishnan says, well, go to Thailand, go to, he worked a lot in Cambodia. Look at their legal system. Go to Islam and look at Islamic laws. Don't just say this is wrong and our laws are right, our legal ideas are right. You have to check other legal systems if you want to be a real universalist. And again, I'm not saying here, let's become relativists. It's not all relative. But we do have to open up in some way when we try to analyze that grand idea of universalism, which is, they say, Western through and through. Okay. Does that mean, when we give up universalism, does that mean that we take sides? Does that mean that we immerse ourselves in political strife? What I want to do is tell a story, the story of Palestine, Israel, of human rights organizations in Palestine, Israel, and the particular story of what happened this last October, having to do with the organizations in Palestine and in Israel. Okay, so that was the end of the philosophy. Organizations do take sides. I'm saying this is reporting on the organizations. Organizations in Israel take sides and organizations in Palestine take sides. But it's not that the Israeli human rights organizations are on the side of Israel and the Palestinian human rights organizations are on the side of Palestine. No, not at all. Notably, the abiding recognition from all sides of the political borders of the Israel-Palestine divide, the almost absolute positioning is that offenders of human rights are Israelis and the victims, the oppressed, are Palestinians. I am just reporting here. You might find an organization here and there who says something different. But on both sides of that divide, Israel is almost always the human rights culprit, and Palestine is almost always, probably always, the victim of human rights violations. So what is the power of the human rights perspective then on political conflict? I'll get to it a little later, but I just want to mention now that, for instance, the attribution of the concept apartheid has now come into the limelight. It's been around. People have been talking about it since 2000, 1999, 2000. That's when people started saying that Israel, or definitely the Israeli occupation in the occupied territories, is an apartheid state, an apartheid situation. But that has now become a human rights issue, and in the last year, we've had all the big organizations adopt that. Is this not a matter of doing politics? Of course it is, but I'll bring it up more exactly soon. Okay, so the Israeli side of the story, I'm going to tell the Israeli side in much shorter shrift than the Palestinian side. Okay, Israeli human rights organizations, there are many more, but these are the ones that most obviously deal with Palestine. Throughout the years, these organizations have been active. Who do we have here? You've got B'Tselem, which is the organization that Andrew mentioned and that I was very active in. It's called the Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, Information Center. And when I do a talk about B'Tselem itself, it's interesting that it's an information center. We've got Mahsom Watch, which in English is Checkpoint Watch, people watching over the checkpoints put up by the Israeli army for Palestinians, where you want to look out for human rights. ICAD is, I'll get to them in a minute, but do I want to say much? I'll get to ICAD in a minute. Association for Civil Rights is basically like the ACLU in the United States, and I don't know what the big human rights or civil rights organization is in Ireland, but there are centrally located, politically centrally located organizations that take care of the whole rostrum of human rights and civil rights, but again, ACRI is very active about Palestinian rights. Physicians for Human Rights are a branch of the international organizations, Physicians for Human Rights, but they are very, again, involved in Palestine, and the Hamoked is a center, the Center for the Defense of the Individual, based on the idea that human rights are individual rights. The ICHAD is the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. It sounds very particularized. There's so many things going on. Why would you have a whole organization about house demolitions? But they'll come up in a moment when we talk about the different types of politicizations that we're talking about. Now, if you look at the history, most of these organizations for many years refused to opine about anything political. You'd ask an organization, are you for one state or two states? That's political. We don't talk about that. Are you for or against BDS? BDS is the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement. That's political. We don't talk about that. Party politics. As an organization, are you supporting this party, that party? Israel has a large offer of parties. The organizations will not say a word about political parties, or at least that's what it was like for many years. You want to take into consideration that most of these organizations came into being in the 80s, maybe early 90s, after the occupation had been going on for 20 years usually. It took a while till somebody thought, we have to worry about human rights here. It was considered for so many years just a military occupation. We don't have to worry about citizens or civilians or people that we talk with, that we work for, or who work for us. And suddenly, it was 20 years later, and human rights arose in that context, but not political. It was doing human rights. The Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions in 2012 came out with a statement officially endorsing the one-state solution. And I found that fascinating. First of all, this organization is talking about home demolitions. Second of all, they are talking about human rights. And then they come out with a statement about one state. Reading that statement is fascinating, the way they tie the strands together. How a one-state solution will, of course, not only solve the home demolition problem, that's any solution would do that, but a one-state solution has to do with individual human rights. It's a hard theoretical argument to make, and they did make it. This was in 2012. The pure veneer of apoliticality had to go in 2014, 2015, 2016, when I want to say things got bad, really bad. Not originally, at that point, between Israel and Gaza, but in the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank all along. And in 2016, B'Tselem put out another statement that made a lot of noise, saying that it was no longer going to share its work with the army. In other words, if there is a complaint about what some soldier had done, B'Tselem said, we will deal with it in the human rights context. We're not going to talk to the army. And the statement said, there is no longer any, quote, there is no longer any point in pursuing justice and defending human rights by working with a system whose real function is measured by its ability to continue to successfully cover up. So B'Tselem said, as human rights workers, we're not going to work with a system that is invested in not being not only accused, but definitely not responsible for human rights violations. This was in May 2016. Interestingly, in September 2018, B'Tselem went even farther, accusing the Israeli Supreme Court of bearing responsibility for war crimes, and that's the word they used. War crimes are now at the foot of the Israeli Supreme Court. That was called by many a declaration of war of a human rights organization against the highest authorities in the land. What could be more political than that? Well, what do the political authorities do then? On its part, the government, the very plainly political bodies, treated these wayward organizations, starting from 2015 or so, with attempts to delegitimize their goals and methods by putting on them formalistic and bureaucratic requirements that made human rights work more tedious, more convoluted, and definitely more hazardous. Official institutions, not unexpectedly also the mainstream media, which is always in cahoots with the official institutions, all went into this by throwing upon the organizations the general aura of illegitimacy. Why would human rights organizations be considered illegitimate? Well, that comes from lack of loyalty to one's own. If you are coming out against your side, then you are illegitimate. Just recently, I was telling Andrew, a book came out by Yuli Novak, who was the previous director of the group called Breaking the Silence. I didn't have them up there, actually, but they're not dealing with human rights. They're doing something a little different. Breaking the Silence was soldiers who got together and told of what they had done while they were serving in the army. Yuli Novak wrote a book that came out a month and a half ago at most, explaining how being within the human rights community in Israel was destructive for her, debilitating for her, self-annihilating for her. Why? Because she was considered a traitor. And you read the book and you realize what it means for someone who thinks they're loyal, who thinks they're patriotic, who thinks they are Israeli. They're a part of this communal being, to be considered a traitor. So that's what the powers that be did. They just stuck the label of traitor on the organizations, and that immediately delegitimized them. Thus did human rights in Israel become political. Thus did the discourse about Israeli human rights organizations within Israel turn blatantly political. And as weird as it might seem, the accusation of treason, even if pernicious, is for me a simplistic act of branding. Because as we've said, lack of patriotism is automatically considered illegitimate. That is, in a sense, less interesting for me than what we have done, we being Israel, have done to the Palestinian organizations. Okay. I'm now going to talk about 6 Palestinian organizations. I will talk at length, I hope not too long, about every single one of them because they are so interesting. How can the powers that be in the occupying side negate the enemy? The enemy is the enemy. What more can you do? What can you say that makes enemy organizations less of an enemy? How can you make them more of an enemy? And this is interesting. You have to negate them in something that I will call, again, purely political. Well, these 6, just a few months ago, on October 22nd, it came out in the news on October 23rd, the Israeli government declared these organizations criminal. Why criminal? Because they are terrorists. So Israeli organizations are traitors. Fine. Being terrorists is much more problematic for any organization, especially a human rights organization. Their story is emblematic of how doing human rights in Palestine has become treacherous. It's a story of Israel's move against the organizations as a reprehensible, for some of us, unimaginable political move. So let's look in more details at these 6 organizations. I'm taking the information about them from all sorts of sources. Some you can just get on the net. Others are in interviews, in personal relationships, in what has come out, especially since October. All right. So let's start with Al-Haq. Let's just mention them. Al-Haq is a human rights organization, prisoner support, and human rights association. You can tell by the name, they're talking about prisoners. UAWC is the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. They're going to be very interesting. Bisan Center is an institute for research and development. What's it doing up there? Defense for Children International talks about children's rights. Defense for Children International is all over the world. This is the Palestinian branch of it. And Union of Palestinian Women's Committee. Let's begin with Al-Haq. It's the most famous one. I usually think of it as parallel to B'Tselem in Israel. Al-Haq report about themselves, or actually declare about themselves, that they were established in 1979, that's pretty early on, to protect and promote human rights and the rule of law in the occupied Palestinian territory. Fine, that's very clear and, so to say, neutral. I won't go into their credentials and into the prizes they've gotten. I mean, this is an amazing organization. But if you look at their purported vision and their mission, I always, when I go into a website of an organization, I look at the vision and I look at the mission, and I try to tell myself, is there a difference between a vision and a mission? I usually go further on into the objectives and their ways of working. That gives you a better idea of what it is exactly they're doing. But listen to the vision for a minute. Al-Haq's vision is to realize the aspirations of the Palestinian people. This is not Palestinian individuals. This is the Palestinian people. In some quarters, people is taken to be synonymous with nation. But there it is the Palestinian people in a free, independent, sovereign, and democratic Palestine where the rule of law and human rights law are respected and adhered to. So there is there, in the human rights work, independent, sovereign, and democratic Palestine. Of course, that is a political vision. And then they go on to describe themselves, saying, Al-Haq is an independent Palestinian human rights organization that seeks to promote Palestinian people's human rights, defend them, and enhance the rule of law and the culture and values of human rights according to the principles of international human rights and humanitarian laws. And then they go on, fight impunity through holding perpetrators of violations of these laws accountable irrespective of their nationality. So they're not saying we're going to hold Israel responsible, accountable. We're saying irrespective of their nationality. And indeed, Al-Haq comes out against the Palestinian Authority, I would say almost as much as they come out against Israel, because they think that the Palestinian Authority violates human rights at some really unimaginable level. All right. Getting a little more concrete, Al-Haq's goals are to, and here you see what they do. They want to influence policies, legislations, and practices of duty bearers so that they become aligned with international law, contribute to effective remedy for violations of human rights, enhance human rights discourse, and influence the international legal jurisprudence. So again, they're focusing on law, on international law, but this is what they want to work on now. And they have a list of what they do. I don't want to go over this again. It will come up in other organizations, but they do conduct research. They prepare reports. They have studies and interventions on breaches of international human rights and humanitarian law. They undertake advocacy before local, regional, and international bodies. Well, there you go again. Is this a matter of taking sides against Israel necessarily? And here's an important point that will come up in a minute. Al-Haq also cooperates with Palestinian civil society organizations and governmental institutions in order to ensure that international human rights standards are reflected in Palestinian law and policies. So they're going to be just as demanding of the Palestinian authorities as the Israeli authorities. All right, Al-Haq, as I said, is one of the most well-respected organizations. They are very professionally human rightist. Okay, next one, Addameer, is the prisoner support. They are more focused. They say, by the way, the word Addameer means conscience, and what they say is that they want to support Palestinian political prisoners, but again, held in Israel or Palestinian jails. So you have, again, this two-pronged focus. Whoever violates the rights of Palestinian prisoners, whether they be in an Israeli jail or an Israeli military jail or in a Palestinian jail, Addameer will speak up for them. And again, the things they do, they offer free legal aid to political prisoners, they advocate rights at national and international level, they work to end torture, other violations of prisoners' rights, they do monitoring, legal procedures, solidarity campaigns, the regular things that you would expect a human rights organization that is focused on prisoners to do. The issues that engage them mostly are the question of isolation, the questions of family visits, medical negligence, access to education. This is, I encounter this a lot with civil rights organizations in the United States that deal with prisons. These are the same type of issues. They have a legal aid unit, a documentation and research unit, advocacy, training, awareness. If you look at any human rights organization, you might find the same type of units. Vision and goals, again, it goes on and on about these very, very well-defined points of vision and goals. But again, this is the place where you finally see that maybe there's talk here of an enemy of a political side. Addameer believes in the importance of building a free and democratic Palestinian society based on justice, equality, rule of law, and respect for human rights, within the larger framework of the right to self-determination. Where did that come in? The right to self-determination, Palestinian self-determination. Why is that being taken care of in an organization that is worrying about prisoner rights? We have so much information about what prisoner rights are. Why is it in the framework of the right to self-determination? Well, that can only be because Palestine and Palestinians do not have self-determination. And again, their goals are the ones that you would expect, and torture and other forms of cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment, and arbitrary detentions, fair and partial public trials, etc. And this has to do with both Israeli authorities and the local Palestinian authorities. Okay, so we don't have time now to go over all of these, but I think you're getting the main idea that these are professional human rightists within a context of a very political situation. I said before something about civil society, and this is going to end up being very important for us. Addameer has been actively involved in the development of Palestinian civil society, in particular in its role as an executive member of the Palestinian NGO network, etc. It plays an important role in structuring the response of civil society to human rights violations, as well as directing strategies for increased community awareness. So suddenly this has become also a point of let's get together in our community. Let's work as civil society, not just on legal aspects, perhaps not just on human rights. We're building a society, a civil society. And I just want to mention that when the first Intifada broke out in 1989, the main thing that we noticed that was way before, no, not way before this actually, but the one thing that came up then was that the first bunch of people that Israel arrested were civil society leaders. They were the people that had to be moved aside. They were the leaders who made the Palestinian society a coherent and very together community, all right? So Addameer is saying, we're working with prisoners, but what we're doing is building up Palestinian civil society. And they say themselves that they want to be more than a service-oriented association, et cetera, et cetera. They liken themselves to Human Rights Watch, to Amnesty International. So they're looking exactly at what we look at when we talk about human rights, but they're doing other interesting things. Defense for children, just like the prisoners were very focused. Defense for Children International is very well known all around the world. And they are committed, as they say, quote, to securing a just and viable future for Palestinian children in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. So there is an occupation. There are children whose welfare has to be taken care of under the heading of rights. And this is what DCI Palestine are doing. And what do? They do regular human rights stuff. I keep saying this over and over again because people often ask me, what do human rights organizations do? In that sense, I'm not even sure that I would think of Frontline Defenders as a human rights organization. It's on a meta level, saying something about human rights workers. What DCI are saying, that they have investigated, documented, and exposed grave human rights violations against children, provided legal services to children in urgent need, held Israeli and Palestinian authorities, I keep repeating that, they held Israeli and Palestinian authorities accountable to universal human rights principles and advocated at the international and national levels to advance access to justice and protection for children. So these are usually very obvious violations, and DCI work obviously, again, with children and about children. I'm going to go on to, there's so much that they do. They tell about themselves that they defend children arrested, detained, and prosecuted in the Israeli military court. We monitor and document child arrests, injuries, fatalities. We implement innovative and groundbreaking evidence-based advocacy to expose grave violations. Again, all to be expected, but the language is important here. The next one is politically fascinating. I'm looking at the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. Sorry, I really did want you to see them as I'm talking about them. That was Al-Haq, that was Addameer. This is the children, and this is the union. Okay, agricultural work committees. Why would that be political, and in what way would it be political? Well, what they are doing is talking to people on the ground about their rights as owners of land, as workers on land, as doing agriculture as opposed to other work on land. In what way would that become political, and not just political, but anti-Israel? Well, they say about themselves, UIWC is an independent agricultural developmental organization, politically neutral as per its bylaws, policies, vision, mission, and practices. This is the first organization that's saying we are politically neutral. Others say we're against Israel, but against Palestine too. Or we do A, B, C, D. We are not worried much about politics. They do slip in a word here and there, self-determination, etc. But here they're saying we are politically neutral. What does that mean? And why do Israelis or Israeli authorities put an organization like that in the group of 6 organizations that have been criminalized and labeled terrorists? Well, I think we know why. A progressive civil society organization contributing to the agricultural sector's development, that is the organization, through empowering farmers' steadfastness and sovereignty on their resources within a sustainable community-based liberational developmental framework. But the important words are steadfastness and sovereignty. Steadfastness is the Arabic tsumud, which is one of the flags flown by the Palestinian populace, saying we are steadfast, we will not leave this land. I haven't said anything yet about, or at all about refugees, about the fact that Palestinians have been pushed out. We usually use the word ethnically cleansed about the land of Israel. Palestinians have retorted with steadfastness. We will stay on this land. And not only will we stay on this land as agriculturalists, but we will have sovereignty. This is very important because most of the members, most of the farmers that are represented by UIWC are in Area C of the West Bank. I don't have time here to talk about areas A, B, and C, except to mention that Area C is the large swaths of land that Israel has been for a long time, but is now explicitly wanting to annex to the state of Israel. There is nothing more political than saying we're helping the people who are going to stay on this land, when the most political issue in Israel right now is how much of that land is going to be annexed to Israel and how much might be left to the Palestinians, given to the Palestinians, put up as a Palestinian state. All of those are very political questions. And what they're saying is, we're not leaving this land. So it looks like a very professional organization having to do with agriculture. It is, again, political through and through. The Union of Palestinian Women Committees, they are quite wonderful and very untalkative. It's very hard to get an interview with the organization. They haven't come out with many statements, but their purpose, and this is what makes them dangerous to Israel, is, quote, to empower Palestinian women on all levels and to contribute in the Palestinian national struggle against the Israeli military illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. Nothing more literally obvious than that. They do talk about developing the circumstances of Palestinian women to achieve real equity between men and women. They do talk a lot about equity among all social classes, but most importantly, they talk about that the union considers itself, this is a quote, part of the Palestinian national movement that struggles against the Israeli illegal occupation to achieve the national independence. All right? That is what the Palestinian enemy is perceived as doing in Israel. I think that organization is the most vulnerable in the way they perceive themselves. They're the most vulnerable to Israeli accusation of being politically at the forefront of the fight for Palestinian, whatever, sovereignty, independence, anything you want to put in there. Okay. Last one is strange. It's the Bizan Center for Research and Development. They're a research institute. We all know research institutes. And what would make them an enemy? What would make them dangerous? Well, what they say is, in Bizan, we continuously seek to enhance Palestinians' resilience and to contribute in building an effective democratic civil society. They're not even saying state. They have a vision, which sounds like many of the others, developed Palestinian society that has a culture, promotes freedom, justice, equality, and dignity. What could be political or terribly political about that? They say that they align themselves with the poor and marginalized. They want a democratic state. They want to emphasize a democratic state. They do talk about liberation in Palestine. That's as near as they get. So the question is, why would they be in any sense an enemy, a political enemy? Okay, there's a lot of other things about each of them. If we get to them in the questions and answers later, we'll talk about them. But I think you get the idea that these are all organizations that are A, professional, they know what they're doing, and B, they are admitting in certain ways, sometimes, not always, they are admitting that there are political aspects to their goals, but they're insisting on civil society rather than state. Nobody says we're going to get a Palestinian state. And they're not talking that much about Israel as the enemy. They do say Israel does violate human rights. But you don't hear the military type of jargon that might somehow explain Israel saying that they are terrorists. What here can be seen as terrorism? Okay, well, here's Israel's move. Now that we know the organizations pretty well, we want to see what Israel did and why. And what Israel did in October basically follows 6 months of similar actions, which I want to spell out for a moment. What Israel did is more ominous than the internal moves against Israeli human rights organizations. So again, Israeli human rights organizations, yeah, they're traitors. People even make a joke out of that. But to label someone a terrorist, to criminalize the organization as an organization, is much more ambitious. On October 22nd, this past fall, Israel's defense minister, Benny Gantz, signed an order declaring all 6 organizations terrorist organizations. In the statement of the act, the ministry described the organizations as operating in a network run by the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a long ago declared terrorist organization. He went on to say that the 6 groups, quote, have received large sums of money from European countries and international organizations while using fraud and deception methods, end of quote. He explained that the PFLP then used the money for terrorist activities, for recruitment, for salaries. Salaries to who? To families of prisoners, political prisoners, terrorist prisoners, to the terrorists themselves. Now, the ministry said, quote, "The groups are controlled by the senior leadership of the PFLP and employ many members of the group in jobs in both management and on the ground, including activists who were involved in terrorism." So the announcement did have some detail. It's being run by a terrorist organization. It's bringing in money for, these groups are bringing in money for the terrorist organization. That's almost like being a terrorist. Well, what is the PFLP? I'm sure a lot of you know. I'm not going to go into the whole history, except to say that the PFLP is recognized as a terrorist organization by whom? By the United States, the European Union, Canada, Australia, and Japan, if I'm not mistaken. No, Australia, no. Yeah, Canada and Australia, yes. So, what more can we say about organizations that have been recognized as terrorist organizations? We're not going to say anything about that, and I'm going to assume that the PFLP is a terrorist organization for the sake of the argument. It's a secular organization as opposed to Hamas. It was always anti-Hamas. It's Marxist. It was founded in 1967, right after the 67 war by George Habash. And it's always popular with the Palestinian voters, with the activists, and yes, with fighters. It's the second largest group after Fatah in the PLO. So this is not a tiny splinter terrorist group. This is a real effective part of Palestinian society. I ask you if it's trite or cynical or dishonest to say that, like many other designated terrorist organizations, the PFLP has a noticeable presence in institutions of civil society in the occupied territories. We knew that about Hamas always. So these groups, if you want to call them terrorist groups, and if they are terrorist groups, that's okay, that's a different discussion, what makes a group terrorist. But what we do not want to take away from them is that they are very active in civil society. They have centers, culture centers, they have poetry readings, they have theaters, they have a lot of educational help, health works. So these organizations, even if they are terrorist organizations, are an active part of civil society. So let's continue with the plot. The response to that announcement by Benny Gantz, the announcement of criminalization, was intense and mostly negative. First, there was vehement denial by the organizations themselves. Then there was derision from other human rights organizations, both international and Israeli. There was condemnation by Israeli leftist organization, for whatever they're worth now, leftist politicians, and this is most important, request for evidence and proofs from diplomatic offices all over the world, especially Europe and the United States. The point was to say to Israel's Minister of Defense, where are you coming from with this kind of accusation? Well, as is always the case in Israel, the authorities, and in particular the foreign ministry, turned immediately to the defense establishments, saying there was rock-solid proof against the Palestinian groups. Indeed, for half a year before the October announcement, the Israeli Foreign Ministry had been asking governments and official institutions abroad to cease promoting, supporting, or donating to these organizations. These organizations get most of their money from European governments and other institutions. A little less from America, a lot from Europe. Well, the foreign ministry, for half a year already, had been sending to all these countries a dossier prepared by the Shin Bet. The Shin Bet is the Israeli Secret Service, purportedly containing the evidence for the criminal behavior. Now, the details of that dossier, which was very secret, were obtained by 3 courageous newspapers. 2 are called Plus 972 and Local Call. They're both Israeli. And for those of you who probably know, The Intercept. So those are the journalistic bodies that got hold of the security dossier. Now, we don't have the time here to go over what the dossier said, but it's important to note the divide between the allegations of the Shin Bet and then, of course, the Defense Ministry and the Foreign Ministry, their spurious claims that the evidence in the report proved the allegations, and the ludicrous contextual and content-filled details that grounded nothing of the sort. As I said, we don't have time except to say that it was all of it, based on evidence by 2 Palestinians who were accountants who had been kicked out of another organization, not one of these 6 organizations. And it was all a matter of common wisdom, conventional wisdom, things that everybody knew. So the sentences that keep going on in the dossier, and we all read it looking for the evidence was, oh, we all know that so many people from PFLP work and do their research in Bisan. We all know that the women in the committee are married to members of the PFLP, stuff like that. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that was really foolproof. Not even foolproof. Nothing that would have held any type of water in a court of law. Okay, so that was happening all summer. In October, Gantz put out his announcement, and leaning on the security status, 6 organizations were criminalized. How do I connect that story with political persecution? For over 5 years now, governments and foundations that fund Palestinian civil society organizations have been investigating everything that comes out, purporting to show that the organizations are doing something wrong, money laundering, moving salary somewhere, and they have always consistently come out with empty buckets. There's absolutely, I think there might be one organization in France, but there's been absolutely no organization that said, oh, I see, the money has gone to the wrong place. So why does Israel continue to do this? And this will be my final point, and I think it explains the politics. The Women's Committee, by the way, said that this has been going on forever, not just the past half year, not the last 5 years, because I usually put 2015-16 as when the bad time started, but forever. And what they're saying is that this is years of political persecution of Palestinian civil society in general, aimed at handicapping it so as to silence it. Why would we need to silence Palestinian human rights organizations? Silence them from saying or doing what? Well, originally, these kinds of accusations came from the right-wing groups that had nothing to do with government. The Israeli army, too, has raided the organization's offices and confiscated computers, legal files, reports, everything. But again, that's not politics, that's the army. So right-wing groups, non-governmental, and the army. About 5 years ago, in 2015, Israel created a new ministry, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. By the way, the head of that ministry was Gilad Erdan, who's now Israel's ambassador to the US. And I think you're getting what I'm saying, that the right wing, the extreme right wing, has now become a central part of official Israel government. It is no longer something on the extreme. It is no longer organizations that are partisan. It is now the government itself. And this ministry, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which I just read last night, had taken off the net its main app. I don't exactly know why. But the ministry was intimately coordinated with the right-wing groups, and it mounted campaigns and pressures to delegitimize Palestinian civil society. The accusations have revolved around the Palestinians' human rights organizations and around their campaigns to demonize Israel. What Israel is trying to do is to demonize them back. All right? So what we're seeing is these organizations that I tried to present as very clean human rights organizations, what we're seeing is the organizations demonizing Israel, telling the world that Israel is not just guilty of human rights abuses, but is a real demon here. And this step taken by the ministry, before that by the army, is a step at demonizing them back, showing that all of these groups are actually saying things about Israel that we need to somehow put to rest. That brings me back to what I said before about apartheid. So El-Haq and one other organization, which one is it? Addameer, right. Addameer and El-Haq have put out so many reports by now about apartheid. It's not just Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. It's the work being done by human rights organizations in Palestine showing that Israel is apartheid. Well, the only way to stop that is to not just demonize these organizations, but make them illegal, criminal, say that they are terrorists. I don't want to take too much time now to say what was done to each of these organizations, except to say that they were all ransacked, they were all burglarized by the Israeli army, not by lunatic right-wing terrorists, settlers, but rather by the army with instructions from the Ministry of Defense. What we've seen now, starting from the October 22nd criminalization, is a dismantling, or an attempt at dismantling from the Israeli side of Palestinian human rights. Okay, so let me just wrap things up. Yeah. Yeah, I've got a list here of the times that Israel broke into the offices of each of these organizations and what they were saying. The political goal of the move of criminalization is clear, like shouting out loud in all these cases. Addameer, Bizan, the children, the women's groups. This goes on, absolutely taking them out of the game. Some of them, by the way, are trying to defend themselves in the court of law, trying to show that they are not connected to the terrorists, trying to bring their finances to show that none of these accusations really hold water. Others are playing a more political game. There are already so many movies on the net showing what each of these organizations does and what it is that they don't do that Israel says that they do. Okay, so let me just say that I often find myself saying, oh, these last 5 months were the worst, or last summer was the worst, or this has been the worst year in the history of the occupation. And I found myself saying it many times about this last summer. I don't even have the time now to count the horrendous events that we've gone through, except to mention Khalida Jarrar, a woman who was prevented from attending the funeral of her daughter in July. She's in jail as having been a member of the PFLP. Again, the PFLP is a party in the Palestinian Authority. She's in jail not for any terrorism, but for being a member of the PFLP. She was not let out of jail in July to be at her daughter's funeral. Note, the person who didn't let her out was the Minister of Internal Security, called Omer Bar-Lev, son of the very famous Israeli military leader, Bar-Lev. And Omer Bar-Lev is from the labor movement. Right? So this is not, again, extreme right. This is central Israel. In September, 6 Palestinian prisoners escaped from the Gilboa prison. In the end, they were all reapprehended. But while they were loose, all of Israel was in a frenzy that we have 6 terrorists running around. Now, of the 6, they were not, I think only one was there under accusations of terrorism. The others were all sorts of prisoners, 2 of them administrative prisoners. But for a week and a half, basically, until they were reapprehended, Israel was in a frenzy about terrorists among us. So finally, in October, Israel criminalized the 6 Palestinian civil society organizations as terrorist organizations. Now, it seemed for a moment, and here I just want to ask a question, it seemed for a moment that Israel could go no lower. It seemed for a moment that the world would not let us get away with it. It seemed for a moment that we had the ultimate evidence for Israel's political criminality. It seemed for a moment that this would be turned, overturned, changed. So many of my friends in the human rights community in Palestine and Israel, in Europe, and in America were sure that this would not pass. There were meetings and webinars, statements and petitions, marches, protests. When was October? 5 months ago? We haven't heard anything for a while now. It all rose, and then it all just petered out. So what is to be done? The fight is a political fight. Yes, human rights is the arena of international law, but human rights organizations are a part of the political game, not only the legal game. Some of the organizations are still pursuing the matter through the courts. Some of the prosecutors of the case are concentrating on the legal aspects. But the fight against the occupation, against apartheid, against oppression, and against such blasphemy as declaring human rights organizations criminal is a political fight and must be based on political actions. I leave you with that question: what is to be done politically? Thank you. Should I do it? Okay, I'm fine. Yeah, it's fine. Okay, so any questions? Yes.
Thank you for that. My name is Ken McHugh. I'm a cultural planner with the I'm the founder of Sport Against Racism Ireland. And we have 2 organisations that we're partners with. One is called Mytholot, it's in Tel Aviv,
Mm-hmm.
and there's the Paris Centre for Peace. These are the sports departments of these organisations. And another organisation many would have worked with is they used to be combatants for peace. I think they're now called non-combatants for peace.
Okay.
As far as
No, there's combatants for peace and they are combatants for peace, yeah. They're relatively new. I mean, they're from 20-something, 2006 or 07. Yeah.
Could I ask you, where do they fit into your list of runners there on both sides? Also, my natural inclination is to observe the boycott. And people, because of, let's say apartheid, you've got boycott, and we're the ones who comes from here, boycott comes from Ireland. So, I'm really conflicted, because if that's the case, then we have to drop our partnership with these 2 very powerful or high impact organisations who work with children across Israel and Palestine. And I just want to ask you what your opinion would be on that.
Okay, thanks. Those are important. The first part categorizing. You know, when I do philosophy, I am absolutely vehement about categorizing things rightly. I think in politics it's a little harder. I was very concentrated here on human rights organizations, and even that, like Bizan says about themselves that they do research that has to do with human rights, but I'm not sure they're really a human rights organization. The reason Bizan came in here was because Israel put it in its list of 6 organizations. And asking why Israel put it there, I think, gets its reply from what I said, that they are very active in defaming Israel and making sure that people know that Israel is apartheid. So the organizations that Israel chose are not necessarily human rights organizations. Most of them are. The Women's Committees has all sorts of other organizations in the committees, not just those working on human rights. So for me, the point here is, how does human rights play a part here? How do organizations, human rights organizations, play a part on the Israeli side? If you're working for human rights at this point of anyone, definitely of Palestinians, sometimes of Israeli citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel, then you are a traitor. With the Palestinians, my reply was that these are the groups who are most influential in turning the world, so to speak, against Israel. And Israel has to somehow erase them. And Israel has been trying to erase them, and it hasn't been very successful. As I said, none of the European governments have really stopped supporting. I'm trying to remember if in B'Tselem, at one point, I think it was the Germans who wrote us that they're giving us less money, but it was because of some internal problem in Germany, not because B'Tselem was doing something that Israel didn't like. So the question, what I would call now, your organizations that you talked about, and I'll get to them in a minute about the boycott, I'm very close to combatants. Would I call them human rightists? Not necessarily. They really are political movements. And that was another point of my thesis here, was that there are political movements all over the place. That's what we do in politics. We protest and we march and we try to write letters and we advocate, etc., but not necessarily about human rights. There is a small point I want to make here. B'Tselem is a human rights organization, and in when was it? Maybe 2012 or 2013, we put out a big report saying that the occupation is a violation of human rights. Now, that was very different in the way you think about human rights. We have the Declaration, the Universal Declaration. We think we know what human rights are and what violations of those human rights are. To say that an occupation is a violation, occupation is something that you get in humanitarian law, not in human rights law, and it's perfectly legal, so to speak, to occupy. Some people are now saying, yeah, but not for so many years. The whole point about occupations in humanitarian law was that it has to be a temporary thing, and we're now trying to deal with the question, what do you do with an occupation that has become permanent? So that's why I'm saying that B'Tselem, even though it is a human rights organization, came out and said the occupation, not even though, because it's a human rights organization, came out and said occupation is a violation of human rights. That was taking a very important conceptual step forward. Combatants, I'm sure, I'm trying to think of the different times that I've spoken to them, I would call them more of a peace organization than a human rights organization. They're not definitely focused on human rights. I know in that I'm sounding too strict, but that's what I try to do when I talk about human rights, not give the name human rights to anybody who's working for anything in Israel, but especially those organizations that we had in Israel that do all work on human rights. The physicians a little less so, and the Checkpoint Watch. They're in the crowd, but they're not exactly human rights. Now that brings me to the second question, and I think there are some real problematics in BDS and other questions that are easier. BDS is the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement. I hope where I think you've probably most heard about it. It was started in 2005 by Omar Barghouti, and the point was to boycott Israel, to sanction it, to divest, just like we did in South Africa. The ultimate comparison is to South Africa, and the claim that in South Africa it helped, that in South Africa that's what stopped the apartheid. A friend from South, what's his name, Ronnie, pardon me? Ronnie Castles. Yes, Ronnie Castles. He was a minister in the first post-apartheid government, and he once told me, don't believe it. The sanctions on South Africa worked, but two other things that stopped apartheid in South Africa were, one, that the young people were leaving. White young people were leaving. Not a few here and there. The point was that this was an exodus out of South Africa. And the second point, says Ronnie Casseroles, is armed conflict. He always says we were not nonviolent. And that's a hard one to take, because we all walk around with the flag of nonviolence, thinking that nonviolence gets you farther than violence. And Ronnie Casserole says, no, if we hadn't engaged in armed conflict, it wouldn't have ended. All right, so that's just about sanctions in general and the parallelism with South Africa. BDS, I always wonder how successful it is, and it fits in beautifully with what I was saying about political. I think BDS is a way to do something politically. It's nonviolent, it is political, it defames Israel completely, and interestingly, it has intricate problems like what you said about working with Israelis. So I have been ousted from 1.5 conferences where Palestinians said they would not be in a conference where there is any Israeli, period. And what can you do except, raise your hand in some sort of innocence perhaps and say, well, you're the leaders, you're doing the BDS, if you don't want us with you, that's fine. I think it's not very smart, but we have seen BDS taken to the extreme that there is no intercourse at all with any Israeli. I think it's wrong. There's interesting discussions about economic versus cultural versus educational BDS. I personally think that the cultural BDS, the cultural divestment and definitely boycott is much stronger than the educational one. The educational one runs up against the kind of questions that you were asking. Any Israeli that puts in an article to be vetted by a magazine, there are people who say, I will not judge an Israeli article, even of an individual person, because they are Israeli. I think that's not smart for a couple of reasons. One is that it doesn't matter to the Israeli government. It's not going to change anything. In fact, the Israeli government, like the previous American government, are anti-intellectual. I mean, they don't care if the whole educational system flops. So it's just not going to be very effective. And on the other hand, it holds internal paradoxes that are hard to go by. Cultural, if Israel's soccer team is not let into the European whatever it's called, that will make Israelis sit up much more than if you boycott educational bodies. I want to give one example, which I've sometimes taken back already. In 2012, in England, not in Ireland, there were boycotts on Oxford Street, I think, in London, against one of the Israeli makeup companies that was getting their materials in the West Bank, on on the Red Sea in the West Bank. What were they called? Ahava, I think. And I think for a year, people protested outside the store there in England, and finally the store closed. And it was considered a great success. And I remember seeing on the front page of Haaretz, lamenting, they closed the shop, BDS succeeded. And the next headline over was, Israel has just been accepted into the OECD. And I thought to myself, okay, you know, in the sense of how effective you are, BDS is not effective on the ground. On the other hand, I think it has done things. I've changed my mind a bit about that because I think it's gotten into people's thought processes, that you don't want to collaborate, definitely not with those parts of Israel that are clearly involved in the occupation. So, but I think I don't mind saying that I am pro-BDS. I just think that we have to work out all sorts of problematics there. So thanks. Yes.
Joe Costello. You know, it's a disgrace that Israel has banned those, criminalized those 6 organizations. But really, it's the oldest trick in the book. When you're effective, an effective human rights organization, you smear it. And the more effective it is, the more you smear it. And by doing that, you neutralize it. It's terrorist, you call it a terrorist organization. It's all part of the propaganda. So, what do you do? That's the question you were asking of us, and I don't think it's easy to come up with any solution. One suggestion could be that what you do is you set up another organisation, and you just start going doing the same thing that you've been done with another different name, and off you go. Secondly, considering that a lot of the European Union countries still recognise all of these organisations as bona fide organisations, and that Israel's relationship with the European Union has got a specific clause all the time that everything is dependent on Israel's observance of human rights, civil rights. Individual countries of the European Union surely should be in some sort of position to, and the European Union as a whole, to say, well, look, you can't just go around getting rid of every human rights organisation that's in the country, willy-nilly, and criminalising them without sufficient evidence. Surely there's a role there for the European Union as well to play.
There is, and when it happened in October, I remember all my friends in the organizations all got in touch with their European counterparts, much more than America. How strong is Europe vis-a-vis Israel as opposed to America vis-a-vis Israel? We're getting here to all sorts of questions about what will end the occupation in general and what will make Israel change its mind. We were just talking at lunch about how South Africa, Ireland, and Israel were all in the same boat in the 80s, and you and South Africa have sort of passed us by, and we are not only stuck where we were, but Israel has regressed. I mean, Israel today, the Israeli populace, nobody knows the word occupation anymore. The discourse has changed. You ask Israeli kids don't know that there was a green line. If you walk into any school in Israel, the map on the board just shows all of it, Israel and the West Bank, and there's nothing noting that this is occupied territories and this is what we used to call the old Israel. So things have changed so deeply now that I sometimes find going to the European Union somehow has some anachronism in it. Now, I don't know what can be done to change that. Those of us inside Israel-Palestine are trying to work together on different solutions altogether, and that is political. So the one-state solution, for all of the derision that it attracts, says that's it is a one-state. And there are good, I think, analytic, political questions about that. And the point I would mostly take from your question is that maybe we have to think differently about things, like really think differently. Maybe the issue of human rights is not the place to center the political discussion. And, I said, what is to be done politically? That would be jumping over the cliff and saying, hey, let's give up on human rights. And I would be the last person to say that, except that I don't see that the human rights enterprise has been at all successful in Israel. So I don't want to sound completely despairing. Yeah, despairing, yes. Desperate, no. Okay, I think there might be a difference there. But we need to rethink the whole question there. Some of my friends, especially in B'Tselem, think that human rights is the only way to go because human rights are so much stronger today than they were 20 years ago. The world is thinking of human rights as part of the conversation and the political conversation as well. So, I don't know, I waver between being very skeptical and holding on to some sort of, not optimism, but hope. But that's a problem. Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. Colin Rafter, I used to be in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and 12 years ago I served in South Africa, and I used to talk to ANC veterans, and they always said the same thing. I talked to Ronnie Castles, I'm not saying he said this, but others certainly said it. They always said, it's not like apartheid, because the Israeli-Palestinian situation is far worse.
They said it.
But the point you made at the very end is very interesting. Do we go for human rights or do we try some other?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that critical to this is the role of the United States and public opinion in the United States. And as you know, public opinion in the United States is very largely pro-Israeli for very well-known reasons. To what extent is appealing to the human rights mantra, the human rights standards, effective in the context of the United States, or is it simply pushed aside because of the strength of the pro-Israeli lobby? Thank you.
Thanks, that's important. First of all, let me just say one thing about the apartheid. If it is worse than South Africa or better, again, I do philosophy of language. I love looking at words and what they mean. In the summer of 2000, I was called up by somebody in England, Palestinians and Israelis. They were starting a group and they wanted to call it the Anti-Apartheid Group. And I said to them, don't do that. Apartheid has a context. It belongs to South Africa. You're not going to get anywhere calling Israel apartheid. And they didn't listen to me, and I'm very glad they didn't listen to me. And they continued. In the United States, by the way, at Concordia University, I think it must be over 10 years now, they started Apartheid Week at the university, and now in many American universities, not hundreds, but many universities have Apartheid Week. And what happened in the last year is amazing. It was human rights organizations that came out and said, this is apartheid. Whether it's exactly like South Africa or not, some Israelis, even good friends of mine, are saying in Israel it's not racist. Well, come on. So the word has gotten a different use. And if we talk about Wittgenstein, a word gets its meaning from its use. So we're using the word apartheid now to attach to Israel. That's just my little spiel on that word and what we get from the concept of apartheid. I am so proud of B'Tselem and happy about Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. By the way, Yesh Din were there even earlier, for putting this on everybody's front burner, that this is apartheid, and that makes people sit up and think about what's going on here. By the way, this is again a tiny bit of, not gossip, just minutiae. B'Tselem wrote the report in January of last year that it is apartheid. Neither the New York Times nor the Washington Post reported on it, not a word, as if it didn't exist. All the others, Mother Jones, The Nation, all the American leftist magazines were all agog. New York Times and Washington Post as if it never happened. In April, Human Rights Watch wrote it, and then New York Times said, yes, and actually it was already done in January by B'Tselem. So you can see how the media is trying to navigate through this. And that brings me to the United States. I thought what you said now about 12, 15 years ago. When I first got to the United States, a little over 10 years ago, I was always invited to speak in reform synagogues. Now, the Jews in America are very well organized in the congregations. Sorry, most of them don't belong to any congregation. But those who do belong are either Orthodox, conservative, or Reform. There's also a bunch of small little groups. The Reform synagogues were asking me to come speak 10, 12 years ago. About 5 years ago, the conservatives started inviting me. Not the Orthodox, granted, but the Jewish community in America is changing. It's a matter of the younger generation. They're a generation that has been brought up on human rights. They know amnesty. I'm not saying anything wonderful about the American general political or intellectual atmosphere, except to say that things are changing. We have 3 or 4 people in Congress now who are fighting the Palestinian fight. We never had that. This goes with the BDS, there are laws in 27 states, I think it is at this point, outlawing BDS. In other words, if you, let me think how this goes. If when you take a job, a state job, in other words, teachers, state hospitals, definitely any state governmental position, and you refuse to sign a form that says, I will not boycott Israel, you don't get the job. It's been taken to court in 3 states already, and the court has taken that down, because you can't tell someone what position they can hold or not hold politically to get a job in the state. So things are changing. It's slow, but it's changing. I can see it in what's happening. And I gave a talk, this must have been 7 years ago, at Wesleyan. It was about some human rights issue, and these 3 kids came up to me and said, don't be so despondent, we're not like our parents. So that was interesting. Right? So I haven't written off the United States. I mean, I know it's bon ton in Europe to say bad things about the United States, and I understand what we're saying, but things are changing. Definitely in the Jewish community. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to be brief, but just to say, first of all, I think the work that B'Tselem does and others in Israel is really important as well. And I don't think it's a small thing to be called disloyal to your state and a traitor. So to all of you who've taken that and continue the work, I mean, just huge credit to all of you, very important. And can I just ask you, if it is the case that you're making an argument, if I kind of understand it, that human rights are politicized within their community or their society or whatever, do you think that weakens human rights if we take away that sort of aura of universalism around it? Or do you think it strengthens them?
I think it strengthens it. Or let me put it in 2 ways. One is, you can't not be political, but I think it strengthens it. And that's when I said, what should we do politically? There are cheap games like public relations. I've seen human rights say, we don't have to do public relations. Well, you do. Okay, so in that sense, I don't mind getting dirty and doing politics, even if politics is not the cleanest profession around. I did mean politics in a deeper way, I think. And what I said about being called a traitor is not that it's not terrible. That's why I spoke of Yuli Novak, who apparently fell apart from that. But I think it's a cheap game to say that someone is a traitor. Whereas what they're doing with the Palestinian organizations is much more nefarious. To criminalize them and to say they're terrorists. And we were very upset when it happened. The Europeans just came through in asking for proof and not getting it. So thank you.
note, say thank you very much, Anna, for a fascinating talk and a really interesting Q&A. Thank also everybody who's come and who's asked questions. Thank the universities again and the Museum of Literature. And I think we're going to offer something through the doors.
People want to stay for a meeting.
If people want to
Yeah.
stay and
Or
socialise a
you
little bit.
can have take your time to
You
do
can
the museum
also-
on the way out. So it's
Have a look at the
Museum.
museum over there. But thank you very much for coming and thank you.